when I first arrived in Cambridge, one of the first people that I met was Dick Waterman. And Dick Waterman was instrumental in the blues revival in the 60s and 70s, and he, was managing and arranging tours for all the old acoustic bluesmen. All us kids that were trying to learn to write songs and play in all these little coffee houses in and around Boston. If we were at loose ends, we'd say, well, let's go see who's at Dick's house, because you'd never know who was hanging out. There'd be Son House would be sitting there drinking whiskey and playing guitar, singing songs, And Dick's redheaded girlfriend was always hanging around too. Her name was Bonnie. I didn't even know she played guitar for at least 3 years. But that's how we met. Well, she lived right around the corner from me when she was still in school. When I first met her, she was a Cliffy. She was at Radcliffe, and right in the middle of Harvard Square. And I lived on Garfield Street in Cambridge, and then she was, if you walk down half a block, you'd come to Oxford Street, turn left, and go down 4 houses, and that was where she lived. And we used to just hang out, drink gin in the summer, and bourbon in the winter. And she just started to take off, and she was still with Dick at the time, with Dick Waterman, when she got her first recording deal. She started just moving in different circles. I was still, just playing this small folk circuit, and I was getting out some by that time. I think I made my first record before she sort of floated out of my immediate ken, and then she was off working with people that I knew, but I wasn't really close to, and making records and becoming bigger. But then Dick started calling me up and saying, "Can you open for us at such and such?" And those middle years, I opened for her a lot. Well, actually, in the early years, she opened for me at the Main Point in Philadelphia, in the Second Fret, I think. And it's a funny thing, we've just kept in touch. I mean, it's a very warm relationship, but we don't really see each other very often because I'm living on the East Coast and she lives on the West Coast. But, I still play shows with her. She had me out to open for her at some of these, the music tents like Chautauqua in upstate New York and stuff like that. And it's a total delight. For one thing, I mean, it feels like we've never been apart when we get back together. It's just, we just fall into conversation the way we always did. And I just love her sound crew. I mean, I go into these places that are enormous. I would not play to a crowd that size on my own. We're talking 4,000 or 5,000 people, and you can hear a pin drop. I feel like I'm sitting in everybody's lap. That's the kind of sound system they've got, and it makes you feel so powerful. Honest to God, that could be the ruination of me. It's an addictive feeling, I tell you. Especially when the engineer knows what it's supposed to sound like. I mean, you run into so many guys that run those big systems who don't have any idea how personal and intimate an acoustic guitar is supposed to sound. No matter how big you have to make it for people to hear it, it's still got to have that quality, And they understand those things, In fact, it's funny, like when I was at 3rd and Lindley today, the woman that does the sound there, I mean, the sound was huge, and it was perfect. She was so good.
I have this is a perfect time for me to say this. If I play 100 gigs in a year, there might be 3 women who are the sound engineers. Mm-hmm. But those 3 women will be 3 of the 5 best engineers that I will have all year.
Yeah.
Maybe a woman just has to be better at it to get the job? Or?
It's like, You don't get to my age without seeing a lot of doctors, and all the women doctors that I've had are the best. They're better at it, and I think you're right. I think it's because they have to be good, and less so now than when we were young men, but there's a competitive thing to it. They just got to be better to get any recognition, and
there's so few opportunities I have to say that out loud that I look for opportunities.
Yeah,
to
okay,
say
I don't blame you. Oh, I met John Prine with Steve Goodman. I was in Chicago, and I already knew Steve, and I think I was playing Old Town School or something, and he came and he had Prine with him, The two of them were hanging out, and I can tell you it would have been about 72 or 73, I think.
What do you remember about that evening?
Very little. I think we went out and had some beers, I remember that, the times that I would run into Steve, I either would see him in Chicago or I would see him in Boston, and every time we would go to a baseball game because he was a big baseball fan. And he loved Fenway Park. Fenway Park and Wrigley were, of course, the two places he loved to go.
Were you a baseball fan?
I am now. It's funny. I never was. I grew up in New Orleans before expansion, and so the closest team was St. Louis, to New Orleans. But then I left New Orleans and made my way up north, and when I got to Boston in '66, and then 1967 was the Impossible Dream Team with Carl Yastrzemski, and I got into baseball in a big way. It was great. There was a sort of a mutual respect thing going on, but we didn't spend enough time together to really get to be friends. I loved what he did, and he would ask me to come and open for him, on these tours in parts of the country where I was a total stranger, a total unknown. He was so generous that way, and he opened up Chicago for me. He opened up, all those Midwestern towns, Milwaukee and Minneapolis, and I remember one time I told him, I tried to thank him, I said, John, it is so wonderful, because the John Prine audience was just a Chris Smither audience that had never heard me. It was a perfect crowd for me. And I told him, I said, I'm really grateful about you bringing me along and asking me on board for these shows. And he just looked at me and said, Chris, I don't do it for you, I do it for me. And I've said this before, but I'll never forget that moment, because I felt that I'd been so warmly included in something that I so desperately wanted, And here was a guy who did it. I mean, he may have been younger than me, but his profile was enormous at the time, and he said, "You're here. I want you here," and it fills your heart up.
His audience seemed to be just really nice, wonderful.
Oh, they are. I mean, they're exactly the kind of people that I look for. You couldn't have better.
Did you play with him in Boston also when he came out?
No, well, he did, but I would go by and say hello. But I never did a show with him there. I did shows in the Southeast. Here we did the Ryman together, just pre-COVID. Well, I was pretty excited. I really, that's like a bucket list gig to play the Ryman Auditorium, and it was a lot of fun. And whoever was on the bill with him, he'd bring them out to sing Paradise. Yeah, and I probably sang that song with him 15, 20 times. And it got to where I actually knew it. I could harmonize, but the Ryman, there's all the ghosts in the walls, and you feel them, You make yourself feel them because you build it up in your mind, and, it's not like you're going to be disappointed because you've almost guaranteed it to yourself that they're going to be there. I feel the same way. In New York, when I play Iridium, and Les Paul is in the walls. I mean, and there's all these Les Paul Gibsons hanging up on the wall, and you feel it. You make yourself feel it. It's kind of a wonderful experience. Yeah, well, it was an old style theater. I mean, of course, it had been redone by that time, and it was all up to code, and, it wasn't the fire trap it used to be. But the first time I was ever in the Ryman, I was 14 years old, and I was visiting my uncle, who was teaching at Vanderbilt at the time, and he took me to the Opry, and there was a fire trap. But I had a wonderful time. Saw the Everly Brothers. It was great. But yeah, all those old theaters, the dressing rooms, they're built back when nobody gave a damn about it. What do you mean? Performers need room? Are you kidding me? We're paying them $5, ain't we? They can go get their own room.
Air conditioning.
Air conditioning? Are you out of your mind?
There was the floor where Hank Williams stood.
Yeah.
Where Eugene Debs stood.
Yeah.
They had professional wrestling at the Ryman.
Yeah.
There's a lot more culture than I realized when I first.
Oh yeah, it's an historic building for sure. Yeah.
Do you remember was that the last time you remember seeing John?
I believe so. Yeah, it probably was. And that was a few years before COVID, and then of course he got sick and died.
Yeah. How did you hear about his passing?
Bonnie called me. And she was really upset. John and Bonnie Raitt they were very tight. And she called me up. She said, John died. She was in tears. But it was, it's funny that there's an irony to it, that he fought through so many things, and then this nasty little thing sneaks up and grabs him. But oh yeah, Townes. Well, I met Townes because my first label was Poppy Records, and I went to Poppy because they were recording Townes, and I thought if they liked Townes, they might like me, and they did. So we were sort of label mates, and we wound up doing a few shows together. One time, we did a week together at this club in Coral Gables, Florida. And that was a raucous time, let me tell you. And we were staying at this hotel for the whole week, 5 nights, I think we were playing at this place. And we'd come back there one night with a couple of girls from the club, and there was nobody in that motel, really. I mean, we were almost the only occupants, so we went swimming at about 2 o'clock in the morning, everybody naked as a jaybird, jumping in and out of the pool. and Townes gets up there was a slide at the shallow end of the pool, and he gets up on the top of that slide. He goes, I'm gonna ski down. On standing up on his feet, and he made it all the way to the bottom, and then his feet went out from under him, and he cracked his head on the edge of the slide, as it went in, and he hit the water like a chunk of hamburger. I mean, it was like, I never swam so fast in my life. I was clear down at the other end of the pool. I got in there, dragged him out, and pumped him out. and he sort of came to, He's sitting there looking at me, Chris, he says, you saved my life. I thought, well, maybe, And That was before I found out that there were innumerable people that had saved Tom's life. and, but he never forgot it. He would always introduce me to people. If I ran into him at a festival, he'd say, "Hey, this is Chris Smith. He saved my life." But he's a lovely guy. He's a lovely guy. He put himself through some hard times, and in the end, died way too soon. It's actually, I think, when I got to New York, the same week that Blonde on Blonde came out, and then I went on to Boston and Cambridge, and I was meeting all these people, and we used to listen to that record. We'd listen to Visions of Johanna, and it was depressing because you keep thinking to yourself, how am I ever going to do something that approaches that, you know? But I covered the song.
Desolation Row.
Desolation Row, yeah.
How do you learn all those lyrics?
I cheat. I don't do them all. Actually, Desolation Row, I compressed it. You know, I combined some verses and rewrote it, and I thought rather cleverly. But the funny thing is that there's so many words to that song that hardly anybody notices that I was messing around with them. And Visions of Johanna, I do the whole thing. But I sort of shifted the signature on it. I do it in 6/4. You know, it's sort of a 3 feel to it instead of the 4/4 that Dylan's in. And I still like to play that song. I play it fairly often.
What are your thoughts about the poet laureate? Or, I'm sorry,
the Nobel Prize. I was quite pleased for him, you know, and for myself, you know. I said, you know, I was sort of like, I sat back and said, look at that, somebody who does what I do just got the Nobel Prize, you know, and I thought that was kind of cool. I especially liked his reaction to it. I thought it was a very considered reaction, in my opinion, you know, because he sat back. I was reminded, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre famously refused the Nobel Prize. And when he was asked why, he said, I can't remember how he put it, but basically the thought was that somebody's got to stay outside, you know. Somebody has to not be co-opted. And I think that Dylan thought about that very thing, you know, before he accepted it. And then he thought to himself, I'm too big for them to co-opt me. This is my chance to co-opt the Nobel. You know, and so he did it because he couldn't be swallowed up by it, you know, and made it part of something he didn't want him to be a part of. So
they can't thrust that upon him.
Yeah.
Which seems to be Bob's whole thing.
Exactly.
Don't put me in some box.
Right.
If I want to jump in some box that you might not expect, I'll jump into it.
Yeah, but I'll jump out of it when you least expect it. Yeah. Never met the man. Had a chance to open for him in Orlando. And I was pretty excited. It was part of a tour that we were doing. I was with my wife at the time, and we went down. We got to Orlando. And the day that the day before, we got to Orlando a day early. And that day, the promoter called. And he says that they'd had some girl, I don't know who it was, open for him in Tallahassee the night before. And it had been some kind of a disaster, and the word had come down from on high that there were to be no more solo openers for Mr. Dylan. And the promoter he was devastated. He felt so bad about it. He said, there's nothing I can do about it. They won't let you in to play. But he says, I'm paying you, you know, here's your check, and you're welcome to come to the show. Please do, you know, my guest. Front row seats, the whole shooting match. And so I went. And I almost wish I hadn't, because there was a duo on opening for him, and I could have blown him off the stage. I don't mind telling you, man. In my personal opinion, I said that should be me up there, and I'd have been a lot better. But that's as close as I've ever come to any interaction with the man at all. I have the utmost admiration, for his work, and I've covered 4 or 5 of his tunes. And, you ignore Bob Dylan at your peril. I handled it pretty well. I don't think I would handle it as well now, because I have a deeper appreciation of what he was and what all those people were. I mean, these were cats that invented it. I mean, they weren't somebody who's just saying, oh, I decided I like blues and I'm gonna learn to play it. These guys made it up from from the beginning. But I don't think I quite appreciated that at the time. But I was excited, so I was determined to sit and watch them and drink just like them, which, later on became something of a burden that I had to get rid of, but it was amazing, and people always have these stories about how these guys would try to hide what they were doing on the guitar and this, that, and the other, and I didn't find any of that. They were as generous and as open as anybody you'd ever hope to meet.
Do you remember what kind of guitar Sunhouse was playing?
It was a steel-bodied National of some sort. It was a resonator guitar. I'm not sure which. Wasn't into the models or anything. It may not even been a National. It may have been a Dobro or I don't know what make it was, but it was one that you could hit somebody over the head with and they'd remember it. Heavy as all get out. I saw him mostly at festivals. I saw him once at the Jazz Workshop in Boston. I saw him once at Club 47. It would be pretty standard. Most of those guys didn't really like just playing like 2 45-minute sets or one whatever. I mean, that's not how they were raised to play. I mean, they just sort of played all night. And they would stop and somebody else would play for a little while. And so it was a little artificially structured for them, but most of them picked up on it pretty quickly, but it was, there was usually somebody worried about whether they should actually go out and get that other bottle of whiskey for them or if they were going to make it through the night or something like that. That's all stuff that I remember in retrospect, but what I remember most is most of these guys were staying with fans, people who would put them up, they had a spare room and they would go over and there'd always be a party after the gig, and if you were lucky enough and knew the right people, you'd be there. Yeah. And many times, Reverend Gary Davis he hardly ever went to bed, he'd just sit up in an armchair all night. He'd have a little bottle of whiskey that he would nip from once in a while. He'd have that big J200 in his lap, and all us kids, we'd be sitting around and drinking beer and smoking pot and playing guitars. And every once in a while, he'd just wake up and look around. And he always had that cigar stub sticking out of his mouth. And he'd, like that, everybody'd stop. And then he'd sing a song. I mean, he'd just go into a song, and it was like he knew what was expected of him. Oh, it's my turn, and he would play, and then he'd say something, and he would be pretty unintelligible by that time, except when he was singing, because we all knew the songs, but then he would just lean back. He'd doze off again. Then his wife would come out and say, "Reverend, are you coming to bed?" "I'll be later, woman."
I'll listen to like Cincinnati Slow Rag, and you hear it, but then you try to play something like that, and there's so much happening there, and it's so advanced. Did he seem like he was just like a whole different level guitar player than a lot of those cats?
He was a stickler. He was one of the few guys of all those guys that actually understood what he was doing. You know, could actually sort of put it into words. And it might not be the words you and I would use, but he made a pretty good percentage of his living from teaching, you know. And I know that Roy Bookbinder, for instance, spent a lot of time with him and traveled with him and learned a lot from him. And he was a pretty strict taskmaster, you know. He'd be after you until you got it right. And he would explain what was going on. Again, as I say, the terms of his explanation might not have been as clear as you would like, but he wanted you to do it the way he did it. You know, he didn't want you to go interpreting.
Wasn't he learning from piano players and trying to do that on guitar?
You might know more about that than I do. I
don't know.
You know, I do know Skip James, who also played piano. He would go back and forth. He was always doing guitar licks on piano and piano licks on guitar. He would go back and forth between the two. A very distinctive style. I think that's probably what made him unique in the way that he was.
I don't know very many people who were like there around these original cats.
Right.
And you were, and I don't even know the questions to ask you to get you to talk
I didn't
about
either.
it.
I didn't either. You know, that's one of the that's a little bit of a regret that I have, that I just didn't know how lucky I was at the time to be hanging around with these guys. But
these are the architects.
Yeah,
of
exactly.
Everything that came afterwards.
Right. Yeah. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, but another way of looking at it is they were just guys, you know, just like you and me. They're just trying to make a living and playing music, hoping they can say something that pleases them and pleases other people enough that they'll pay them to do it.
It's kind of, I was going to ask, were they held in any esteem by...
well, they certainly were by us. Yeah, I mean, we were kind of in awe, you know. And at the same time, it was interesting because you'd have to be pretty thick not to realize the cultural gulf that was between us. You know, we looked at them somewhat awestruck, happy to be there and learn from them, but at the same time vaguely aware that there was a chasm in between our lives and their lives, and what their reality was and what ours was, you know. And I know in retrospect that I would spend a lot of time just hoping I didn't put my foot in my mouth some way, because I just didn't know what I was doing, because I was just some dumb kid, you know.
And you come from a certain level of privilege.
Exactly.
And they come from a completely different background.
Yeah. And yet, in another context, they were on a pedestal and I was below them, you know, looking up, trying to learn, you know, which now is called cultural appropriation, but I didn't think about it that way. I just wanted to know.
Swindlers and losers.
That's right. That's right.
Did you ever cross paths with Leighton Hopkins?
He was the one that I never met. And he was an early influence on me. In fact, he was the first. When I was 17, I went to Mexico City for my first year of college. I was going to be an anthropologist in real life. But I was playing guitar, and I had a roommate in Mexico City from Texas, and he was totally into my rudimentary playing and the people that I was listening to, and he handed me this record. He said, "You should listen to this guy." And it was a Prestige Bluesville record, and it was Leighton Hopkins, Blues in My Bottle. And I was hooked. I couldn't believe it. I thought there were 2 or 3 guys playing in the first place, because I didn't know anything about, you know, finger picking. I was basically, at that point, still a 3-chord thump and bash guy, you know. Strum. And I think I said to Tom Whitten was his name, my roommate. I said, "Which one of these guys I'm supposed to listen to?" He said, "There's only one guy playing." You know? I did see John Hurt. I saw him several times. The first time was again while I was still in college, and I was still trying to be an anthropologist, and I was on my way to France, and for a year, my third year of school. And I had to go to New York to catch the boat. We still went to Europe on a steamship, the SS United States. And this friend of mine at school at Tulane lived in Yonkers, just outside of New York. And he says, why don't you come a couple of days early? You ever been to New York? And I said, well, not really. And he said, come on, we'll see if... And he wasn't really into my kind of music at all, but he knew that I was, and he knew that there were places to see people in New York. So he says, why don't you come? You can stay with me for a couple of days before your ship sails, and we can catch some music. Well, I was all about that, so I went, and I got to his house. He picked me up, I think, at the airport or train station. I forget how I got there even. And he said, oh, I got the voice here. Let's see what's going on. And he opens up the paper, and he says, the Gaslight. You ever hear of the Gaslight? I said, yeah, I have. And he says, there's somebody there tonight. He says, Mississippi John. And I said, Mississippi John, are you kidding me? I said, we got to go. Come on. So we went down. I think it cost us $3 to get in, which was a lot of money. We're talking 1964. So we got down there, and I remember it was in a basement. The Gaslight was in a basement in the village, and I'm sitting there. This kid comes out on stage in a Madras shirt with a big Guild guitar. And I didn't know about opening acts. I didn't know anything about this scene. All I knew was my hero was supposed to play, And so this kid plays a song, and then he plays another one. It was all right, but... So there's this real hip-looking guy sitting at a table next to me, And so I said, who is that, And he gave me this look like, you shitting me? And I go, no, like, who is it? And he says, it's Tom Paxton. And I go, what do I know from Tom Paxton? I don't know, So I sat there and I listened to another song, and then I see, coming from behind the stage, he was unmistakable, and he had the same hat on that I'd seen him in pictures from Newport, It was John Hurt, And he comes around, and he sits at my table right behind me, watching Tom Paxton, So I was so thrilled, I turned around, I was going to say something to him, and he shushed me. He goes, 50 years later, I got around to telling Tom that story, I saw you, he said you were opening for John Hurt in 1964 at the Gaslight, and I just wanted you to know that he shushed me in favor of you. Tom looks at me, he says, damn straight, I hope you took it to heart. So then, I'll never forget this night. It's indelible, So then after John Hurt comes up, after Tom finishes his set, and John Hurt gets up there, and I'm in heaven, and he plays 2 or 3 songs. And then this kid shows up with a harmonica and starts playing with him. Well, I was annoyed because I was trying to listen. I didn't know how to separate, sounds at that time. I was not a sophisticated listener. And, so I just wanted to listen to John Hurt, and the harp was getting in the way, I thought, But I didn't want to see dumb or anything. So I turned to that same hipster that I'd asked about Tom Paxton. I said, who's that playing harmonica? And he looks at me again like, are you sure? I said, no, who is it? He says, that's John Sebastian. So what do I know from John Sebastian? Nothing, And like 3 years later, I was on the Jersey Turnpike, and I hear, hot town, summer in the city, back of my neck. And I told, I wasn't that long ago, 4 or 5 months ago, I told that story to John. Sebastian. And he stopped me. We were all backstage with Happy Traum and Cindy Cash Dollar and some people doing this show in Woodstock. He says, I've got living proof. I got living proof that I played with John Hurt. It's fun.
You have a record out today?
Mm-hmm, this very day. It's my 20th album, and it's called All About the Bones. It's on Signature Sounds, and it's getting some attention, so, that's what we hope for. I was quite pleased with the way it came out. It's a small group that we got on there, so there's one tune that's virtually solo, just me, but Betty Sue singing harmonies on a lot of it, and Zach Trajano playing a drum in a variety of different ways, but it's pretty minimal percussion. My producer, David Goodrich, Goody plays a few little things. He's all over the record, but it's all little touches here and there, and it was a lot of fun to make. And then on 4 tunes, we have some absolutely phenomenal saxophone by the one and only Chris Cheek, who just happened to be in town and willing to come in and lend his considerable talents to the project. And it has a very tight, intimate feel to it, Betty Sue's vocals, her harmonies are just the tightest. They worm their way into the structure of the song in a way that just pleases me enormously. It achieves something that I'm always looking to achieve, which is to convey to the listener that I'm trying to tell you something. If you just listen to me.
She's wonderful.
Yeah, she is.
I've never met her, but the energy that she puts out is just wonderful.
Oh yeah, it's live. It is. 8 originals and 2 covers. I did an Eliza Gilkison song. It's a very beautiful piece, and a Tom Petty song that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get into, but Goody recommended it, and then it was in G, and I was having a hard time getting my groove into it, and then I transposed it to A, and all of a sudden I started to wish I'd written it.
Which song is it?
Time to Move On from that Wildflowers album. Yeah.
When you start a record,
yeah,
like what did you have in mind, if anything at all, for this record?
Nothing really.
No preconceived notions?
No, not really. And I tend to, I don't write all the time. I write for projects, I say it's time to make a record, and basically I write the songs and I make the record so that I can go perform. And when stuff starts to feel a little worn around the edges, and I know it's time for new material, I work best with self-imposed deadlines, and so, I'll tell, this time I told Goody, I said sometime back in 2022, I think I said, June 23, I'll be ready to record. And then I got to get busy and write the tunes, or learn whatever cover I'm going to do. And I had a very hard time this time getting started on that. And I didn't have any trouble coming up with guitar ideas and musical ideas, but the lyrics were evading me assiduously. So June rolled around, I had one song. Goody says, I think we're going to put this off until October. And I said, okay. And he says, I'm coming up. He lives in Texas. I live in Massachusetts. He says, I'm coming up. And we've got this relationship. We've been working together for 20 to 30 years. And he comes in the room, and things change for me, for the better. And we just started fooling around, and we had a 3-day session and then some Zoom sessions afterward. He went back home, and I was off and running, and I wrote all the tunes in a space of about 2-3 months. And in October we went in and knocked the record out in 5 days, and we're really happy with it. But as you were asking about, what notion, I didn't have any notion. I didn't know what was going to happen. But of course, the interesting thing is that when you write like that, all the songs at once, they're sort of littermates, so they bear a certain resemblance to each other, and there's a relationship there that is apparent if you pay attention. Yeah,
I agree with that. I'll say this for anybody watching who might need to hear this. Sometimes it's harder as we get on in life, like we raise the bar as to what we think quality is, because we've experienced so much quality from other people.
Right.
And when you're 20, you've yet to experience that, so we have the ignorance to just do it.
Exactly.
We don't know how bad we might be or how good we might be.
Very perceptive. You start wondering whether it's worth saying. Instead of just being glad you got anything to say.